Hello and welcome back to Retro Ranger. In this episode we're talking about Esoteric Atlus games. And of course Atlus needs no introduction to you all, what you'd give to have bought them all and have kept them sealed. Outside of their massive series Shin Megami Tensei and its fantastic offshoot, the Persona series, they actually developed, published, or did both for over 330 games. Today we're going to look at some of the Atlus titles that only some of the pockets of gamers likely know about. Let's jump in! Okay, first up is a whimsical journey in the land of JRPGs. This is Rhapsody, a musical adventure for the PlayStation 1. There's something to be said for JRPGs in the 90s and early 2000s. It really was the golden age for the genre, and revisiting these is always a treat. Rhapsody is no exception, and you can tell immediately from its colorful and vibrant art that this game is something special. You play as a young girl named Cornette, who has something special herself, namely that she can talk with puppets, the latter of which seems to be awfully prolific in this world. Not only can she talk with them, but through the power of her magical horn, she can recruit these puppets as allies and command them in battle. If you've ever played the more recent Ni no Kuni Wrath of the White Witch, you'll get a similar vibe here, though if I'm honest, I actually prefer it with Rhapsody. Like most RPGs, you'll explore unique areas, you'll battle random encounters and bosses, solve light puzzles, and be entertained by the story, and there's a lot of story with this game for sure. While the theme is light and overly cute, the dialogue is very well written, and importantly, it's funny. As Cornette, you're chasing after the main antagonist, a witch who froze the prince as stone. Cornette is madly in love with this prince, and with some of the great story elements leading up to that petrification event, where Cornette is attempting to get the prince to notice her, and it's hilarious at all times. Following Cornette is her companion puppet named Kururu, and they bicker like sisters, which makes for some of the best conversation in the game. There's some fourth wall breaks here that don't get too overused, and overall the game brings a ton of charm when combined with the overall bright art package. I mentioned that the battles come in form of random encounters, but what's interestingly is that those battles are of the tactical variety, where you move on that rigid grid and you select your action and so forth. What's interesting here is that it's actually pretty light on the tactical space, such as no bonuses for positioning yourself behind an enemy, or at least as far as I can tell. And while you might scoff at that, it does make the pace of combat really tight, and could easily go toe-to-toe with a normal turn-based combat system in terms of battle durations. I enjoyed this more than I thought I would, as I tend to like that more tactical stuff, but it works here and it ties into the overall lighter theme of the game itself. Unfortunately, there's no voice acting with this title, and that's really disappointing given the quality of the story and the dialogue itself. I would have loved to hear this play out and add further enjoyment, but sadly you'll be stuck with your inner monologue version instead. It's worth noting that there are lots of songs with fully sung lyrics to help curb that disappointment, and if you love those songs a lot, you're in luck since they came on a soundtrack as part of the overall physical release.
So good to hear. Sounds a little sad but sweet just the same.
At the end of the day, I really enjoy this game, even if it's a bit of a guilty pleasure. It's not going to be difficult, but you can actually crank that setting up when you start a game, and I'd recommend doing so. Either way, it's a fun RPG experience that will have you laughing and potentially singing along before the end of the game. In 2008, they re-released this for the Nintendo DS, but I think it falls a bit short, as even the combat system got swapped out. If you've not yet seen Rhapsody, a musical adventure for the PlayStation, this might be one to get on your list. Switching to the NES, this Atlus-developed and published title, called simply Widget, was based on an early 90s cartoon series of the same name. I never watched it, so let's judge this game on its own merit. This might be one of the harder games on the system actually, as each stage is a gauntlet of enemies and platforming. A saving grace is that the game will let you have unlimited continues, but after attempting the first stage for maybe the 500th time, that might be a moot point. Anyways, you play as Widget, and it's your standard platform and shooter experience. I'd call it a run and gun, but Widget moves more at a snail's pace, and crawl and gun doesn't seem to quite roll off the tongue. Controls are tight, which can be helpful, but every enemy that you're going to encounter takes multiple hits to kill, and that gets old quickly. Moreover, when you get hit, you're getting knocked back like you're a Belmont in Dracula's castle. And if that knockback boots the enemy that you've been fighting off screen, well, that's a shame because they're about to get reset and you're about to begin the dance of frustration all over again. Widget will get the ability to transform into different things, like a flying dragon thing, or a cannon thing, or this rat thing. It adds some depth to the gameplay as you'll be required to puzzle solve a bit, though the game certainly would have been far better off with more of that. Transforming requires MP, which is of course limited, and you can definitely get stuck in parts if you don't have enough MP to change into the required shape to progress. Overall, the difficulty and the frustrations really outweigh any fun factor for this game, and it's clearly one I wouldn't recommend. If anything, it teaches us that Atlus was capable of making a big stinker. Let's move on. Okay, what do you get when you take a JRPG and you combine it with a dating sim? The answer is Thousand Arms for the PlayStation 1. Co-developed alongside Red Company, Atlus also published this title during the JRPG heyday for the genre, but for some reason it largely goes unmentioned today. The words dating simulation might have scared a few folks off, but in truth it's actually a great catalyst for the game's humor and it plays a significant role in other areas which we'll get into shortly.
Babe! You're too beautiful to be sad. Smile. I'm here with you.
You think I'm beautiful? Help me then!
You play as Mice, who is a certified creep and also a spirit blacksmith who can forge magical weapons, and it's up to him to find 5 legendary flames to prevent the end of the world. Of course, there's some menacing enemies known as the Dark Acolytes, and they're attempting to do the opposite by collecting the flames for themselves. Mice seems more interested in charming women than the more pressing matters at hand, but despite his ridiculous behavior, getting more intimate, as the game refers to it as, with the girls, is important for Mice's ability to forge weapons. And despite being a pervert, he does have a good intention, and he learns some important lessons along the way.
I was thinking about you too. I'll see you later.
As the intimacy level grows for the various girls that Mice can be acquainted with, it unlocks different weapon forging paths, which are helpful because they can add spells to a party member's weapon, and that's crucial for your success. In addition to the humor, another really strong aspect of this game is the storytelling, which includes cutscenes. These cutscenes are often voice acted, and they have all superb quality. And the dialogue again is really well written. Beyond that, the game uses a camera to pan to introduce hand-drawn animation for the cutscene characters, and it blends this style with that of the in-game engine. And it gives it a really unique feel that I actually really enjoyed.
You'd still be chasing women. What have you been up to? What? A blacksmith apprentice? Are you serious? You? Mice? I don't believe it!
You must be Musa. I've heard a lot about you. I'm Sedina, Jabal's sister. It's nice to finally meet you.
Huh? Mice?
What's wrong, Musa?
The art within the battle scenes is equally pleasing as it continues that hand-drawn look and feel, which really pops over sprites. Speaking of battles, like many RPGs of the time, Thousand Arms employs a turn-based combat system, selecting your actions for the various members. One unique component here, though, is that the positioning, as both the enemies and the heroic party are split between a forward position and backwards positions. Only the character in the forward position can attack with their physical weapons, leaving those behind them to support with spells, items, or have some of these random events like taunting an enemy, for instance. While I applaud the trying something new here, right, and having one attacking character, it just stretches out the combat time a bit too long, especially in the beginning of the game when you have limited spells at your disposal. Later you'll get special attacks that can have you target multiple enemies, and this will help the pace. So how does this rank when you compare it with other RPGs? The humor, the art, and the dialogue all help this stand out amongst some of the other tedious elements of the game, like the slow combat and the slow map traversal. I'd call this middle of the road, as there's definitely worse RPGs out there. If you've never heard about this one before, I'm not surprised, but perhaps it calls your name now.
What the hell are you doing at a time like this? The enemy is closing in on us.
That's exactly why I'm with this pretty woman. I'm making a stronger sword.
Well, you are a spirit blacksmith, and this, I guess, is your job, but I don't know about this woman thing. Don't you think there are other things you should be doing now, like gathering weapons and soldiers or something?
I am very impressed, Mice. That's my son.
Back on the NES, we got Wacky Races, a game built around the Hanna-Barbera cartoon of the same name. Now, Wacky Races tends to land in a little bit of a blind spot for some people, and chances are that you're already well familiar with a lot of the Hanna-Barbera works, like the Flintstones, the Jetsons, Scooby-Doo, Yogi Bear, the Smurfs, and so much more. But if you say Wacky Races to a room of the same people, you'll get some surprisingly blank stares. Either way, let's talk about the game. Unlike the last NES adventure for Atlus, Wacky Races is a great game, even though it follows the same basic formula of an outdated IP-based platformer. You play as Muttley, the dog from the cartoon, and you have your typical jump and melee ranged attack. The controls are tight still, and you have what you'd expect from an 8-bit platforming game. Throughout the levels, you'll collect 2 different types of pickups. There's the gems, which give you an extra life once you've collected 100 of them, and bones, which is where the game gets really interesting. On the bottom of the screen, there's 4 power-ups to choose from. A bomb, which acts as an arcing projectile, the dog bark, which is a straightforward shot projectile, and the wings, which lets Muttley glide down from jumps, and lastly a heart, which will help you both refill your health and also give you another permanent HP, up to a maximum of 6. Each time you get a bone, the selection indicator for the power-ups on the bottom moves up 1, and it will wrap around if you get a bone when you're already on the heart, for instance. Usually though, bones are optional, but some are not and will force you to make some decisions on how you want to proceed. Even though it arcs, I think the bomb is by far the best weapon choice, and it just oftentimes, you'll be above enemies on a platform and it's convenient to be able to drop bombs from above. The world itself is divided into 3 main areas, and each area has 3 to 4 stages within. Those stages contain a number of sections within that, and each of those ends with a boss. These boss fights are simple, but they're also challenging and fun, consisting of multiple stages of the fight. Unlike Widget, most enemies here die in one hit, and the stages themselves retain a fun feel throughout. The graphics and music are good for the system, and there's not much you can gripe about here. In fact, the only negative thing I can really say is that some of the stages have some funky screen transitions, like they just haphazardly threw some of these stages together, but that's of course really minor and doesn't detract from the fun to be had here. If you're looking for an Atlus game on the NES, Wacky Races is definitely the one to choose. Okay, switching over to the PSP, here's one you practically never hear anything about. It's called Crimson Gem Saga. Atlus only published this title in North America, but once you pop it in, it feels like it definitely belongs in the Atlus family. If you close your eyes and you picture a JRPG in your mind's eye, chances are you're pretty darn close to Crimson Gem Saga, and that's because this game is about as tried and true to the genre as you can get. I couldn't think of anything that's unique to this title alone, but what it does have works well here individually and combined with the other elements. You control Killian, a military student that graduates the day you enter the plot. He's likable since he's a hard worker and a good person, but that's almost to a fault. He's a bit boring. But thankfully, he's joined by a cast of 3 and more characters as the time goes on, and they add much more intrigue to the overall fellowship. After graduating and joining an elite militia, his first day on the job, the entire outfit is wiped out by a menacing guy with wings and his pet werewolf. Killian is only barely saved by Spinel, a rogue treasure hunter whose character is actually interesting, and they end up joining forces since Killian is without direction and she quickly takes him on her treasure hunting adventure, unbeknowingly the same treasure that the winged guy is actually after. They meet a few more party members and they all join forces, actually rather too quickly from a story perspective, and while the story is generally well written, the dialogue around getting these characters to band together is comically concise. Either way, it doesn't detract from the fun and the extra muscle comes in handy, so it's hard to complain. You'll explore dungeons and towns, upgrading weapons and armor, stocking up on the usual RPG items, and basically all of it just comes naturally since you've done it before, unless this happens to be your first RPG ever. Combat is turn-based, and I always appreciate the turn marker on the top of the screen. I can't recommend upgrading weapons as fast as possible since they actually have a big impact on damage. With 4 characters in your party and typically 3 to 4 enemies that you fight each battle, these can get a bit too long, especially since there's a bunch to be done.
You should have retreated.
Those battles aren't random encounters, but rather you trigger them by running into an enemy in the world, which transitions you to a battle screen. If you can sneak up on enemies, you'll get a free ambush attack, and they of course can do the same to you if you're not looking. And enemies can typically see pretty good, so you end up fighting a lot. In addition to the normal melee attacks, you'll get specials and spells depending on the skills that you choose. These are just okay in terms of the art, and I felt that they could have been much more epic considering that most characters can only do about 2 to 3 of these before they're out of MP. You can upgrade existing specials with medallions that you get from Spoils of War, or you can unlock new skills altogether in a character-specific skill tree. These skill trees take SP, which is also earned from the battles. Of course, there's your typical boss fights, which are appropriately more challenging, but actually a bit of a lackluster element. There's no boss fight music, for instance. It's the same as the normal battle music, and bosses, like all enemies, have visible health bars, which always felt like it spoiled some of the challenge. Those complaints aside, Crimson Gem Saga is a solid RPG and again feels like Atlus with strong art, good story, and a well-done voice acting job, and all the elements that you'd associate with these wonderful and classic JRPGs. You really can't go wrong with this game.
Not in the face!
It's my turn!
Here's a newer release from Atlus that originally hit shelves in 2020 for the PlayStation, but it wasn't until 2022 that it came out for the Switch, where it crossed my path. This is 13 Sentinels, Aegis Rim. As the name implies, you control 13 characters who each have their own backstory, motivations, and personalities that ultimately come together as Sentinels, essentially mechs, to overcome the kaiju, basically monsters like Godzilla. The culmination of these individuals is a key aspect of the story, as they each originate from some of the different time period, notably a few from the 1940s, some from the future, and some from the present day, which is actually set in the 1980s. As you progress this story, you'll begin to meet new people and gain access to their storyline, and since they all come from different time periods, the chronology jumps back and forth. You learn that some people have the ability to not only change their appearance, but also travel through time, which is how the 13 eventually all meet together.
Oh man, you're really gonna... PJ, wait up! Don't leave me behind.
I'm definitely skimping a bit on the story as there's much more to it, but that's kind of the general gist of it. As you hop between the different characters, you explore the environments and story of that person, where you talk with people and begin to uncover more of the larger connection. These sections are really nice looking 2D side-scrolling sections that highlight a lot of the qualities that people associate with Atlus today, and certainly in terms of polish. The voice acting is great, and both the dialogue and how it's presented makes this game really engaging. There's a light, puzzle-like thought bubble mechanic that allows the character that you're currently controlling to collect their thoughts in an inner voice, and you can choose to use your findings in conversation for the scene.
Here you go. Well, let me know if you have any others to recommend.
Sure, yeah.
You've really turned into a movie buff, huh?
Do you think it's too much? Well, now that you mention it, I've been seeing this stuff in my dreams, too.
Yep, definite movie addiction.
These appear to be somewhat optional, and I'm curious to know what effect that they have on the gameplay, but in general, it's a good experience and it adds to the overall enjoyment of the story. In between these side-scrolling story sections, you jump into the Sentinels and they're battling the kaiju, who are attempting to defeat these bases, which the game calls terminals.
They're finished! Yes! Unbelievable. I'm acting like an amateur. How's that? What next? Here it comes! I swear. Now you've done it. Unbelievable. I'm acting like an amateur.
These sections play out largely like a strategy RPG, where you have city roads that act as your usual grid, and those attacks are carried out with telegraphed ranges that hit multiple enemies. There's a slight element of tower defense here as well, that you need to protect the health of the terminals, and it works well with the tactics side of the battle. I enjoyed these sections quite a bit, especially getting the enemies to line up and blast them with some huge attack.
Enemy on the move. Target confirmed. Did I get it? Enemy down.
That was awesome!
That electromagnetic round has the power of a sound.
That said though, the graphics here are a letdown, as you're basically an icon on the screen attacking, well, other icons. It works, to be clear, but it's a strange choice, and I wish they would have rethought this whole experience a bit more, since the gameplay itself is fun. Overall, it's a great addition to the Atlus library, and if you're looking for a more unique take on the strategy RPG formula, this might be right up your alley.
What do I do? I can do it! It worked! Are we getting their numbers down?
What can I do? Damn Kaiju! That hit! Kaiju down! Aegis activation confirmed. This area is now protected.
And there you go, some pretty interesting and lesser known titles from one of the better known publishers of today. I'm curious to know which ones that you already knew about, or maybe you've already played. Maybe they're not as hidden as I suspected, or maybe you learned something new. Either way, let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching Retro Ranger.